The most sinister secret in Appalachian history. Mary Ellis, the black girl who vanished after the fire. In the autumn of 1987, during the demolition of the Old Mercy Baptist Church in Ellijay, Georgia, construction workers discovered something that should not have existed. Behind a false wall in the church basement, sealed within a brick chamber that showed no door, no entrance, no means of construction from outside, they found a child's shoe. A single leather shoe, sized for a girl of perhaps 12 years old, preserved as if new despite 3/4 of a century entombed in darkness. The shoe was filled with ash. Human ash, later analysis would confirm. And pinned to the tongue with a brass tack was a photograph. A young black girl in a white Sunday dress, eyes staring directly at the camera, with an expression that witnesses unanimously described as knowing. On the back, written in faded ink, Mary Ellis, age 12. May God forgive what we have done. October 1912. The workers called the sheriff. The sheriff called the state police. The state police called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And the GBI, after 3 weeks of examination, quietly sealed the evidence and declared the case closed due to insufficient information to proceed with an investigation after 75 years. But in the communities of northern Georgia, in the hollers and ridges where oral tradition runs deeper than written record, the name Mary Ellis had never been forgotten. She was the girl who vanished after the fire, the child who walked into flames and never walked out, the ghost that mothers invoked to keep their children home after dark. Don't stray too far, or Mary Ellis will find you, still burning, still looking for the ones who lit the match. For 75 years, she was legend. And then, behind a wall that should never have been sealed, she became evidence of something far more terrible than any ghost story could contain. Wait. Before we proceed to the archives, if this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The Appalachian Mountains of northern Georgia in 1912 were a world unto themselves, isolated by geography, insulated by poverty, governed by codes that predated the Civil War and would persist long after it. This was Jim Crow country, where segregation was not merely law but theology, where the color line divided not just water fountains and schoolhouses, but the very air people breathed. Ellijay, the county seat of Gilmer County, had a population of approximately 800 souls. 2/3 white, 1/3 black, with a handful of Cherokee families living on the margins, invisible in official counts. The town's economy relied on timber, copper mining, and subsistence farming. The nearest railroad was 20 miles south. The nearest hospital was 40 miles in Atlanta. When something happened in Ellijay, the town dealt with it internally, according to customs that bore little relationship to the laws written in distant courthouses. In this context, the existence of Mary Ellis becomes both explicable and profoundly mysterious. She was born in March 1900, according to records discovered in the Bible registry of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of only 2 churches serving the black community of Ellijay. Her parents were listed as Samuel Ellis, a timber worker, and Rebecca Ellis, a laundress. She had 2 younger siblings, a brother, Thomas, age 8, and a sister, Ruth, age 5. By all accounts that survive, and they are fragmentary, filtered through decades of silence and selective memory, Mary Ellis was an unusual child. Precociously intelligent, quietly rebellious, and possessed of what her community described as the sight. In Appalachian folk tradition, the sight refers to a form of second vision, the ability to perceive things hidden from ordinary eyes, to sense the presence of spirits, to know truths that have not been spoken. It is not quite prophecy, not quite mediumship, but something in between, a sensitivity to the world's invisible architecture. Testimony gathered in the 1940s by a WPA folklore project includes a brief mention of Mary Ellis from an elderly woman identified only as Aunt Geneva. That child saw things, knew things, would tell you when someone was fixing to die or when trouble was coming down the mountain. Folks was scared of her, but in a respectful way, like she was touching something the rest of us couldn't reach. The preacher didn't like it, said she was trafficking with darkness, but her mama just said she was listening to what God whispered. The preacher in question was Reverend Josiah Whitmore, pastor of Old Mercy Baptist Church, the same church in whose basement the shoe and photograph would be discovered 75 years later. Whitmore was a complicated figure, product of the deep contradictions of his time and place. A white man who ministered to both white and black congregations, holding separate services, naturally. He was known for his powerful oratory and his belief in what he called divine order, the conviction that God had ordained a specific hierarchy of race and class, and that any deviation from this order was not merely social transgression, but spiritual rebellion. Yet he was also, by some accounts, a protector of the black community, using his influence to shield them from the worst excesses of white violence. He intervened in at least 3 instances to prevent lynchings, arguing that earthly justice should be tempered with Christian mercy. Whether this was genuine moral conviction or a paternalistic desire to control his black congregation remains debated by historians. What is not debated is that Reverend Whitmore took a particular interest in Mary Ellis. From a letter written by Whitmore to a fellow minister in Chattanooga dated August 1911, "There is a colored child in my parish who troubles me greatly. She possesses an intelligence far beyond her station and age, and I fear it will lead to tragedy. She reads voraciously, where she obtains books I cannot determine, and asks questions that would be impertinent coming from a white scholar, much less a Negro child. Worse, she speaks of visions and prophecies, claiming divine inspiration. I have warned her mother that such talk borders on blasphemy, but the child continues unabated. I am at a loss as to how to guide her toward proper humility without breaking her spirit entirely, which I confess I have no desire to do. She is, despite everything, a remarkable creature." This letter, preserved in a church archive and discovered by researcher Dr. Ellen Hartwell in 2003, provides one of the few contemporary written references to Mary Ellis before the events of October 1912. It reveals Whitmore's ambivalence, his simultaneous recognition of Mary's gifts, and his conviction that those gifts were dangerous, particularly in a black child who, in his view, needed to learn proper humility. The tension between recognition and suppression would prove fatal. The other key figure in Mary's story is a man named Thaddeus Cobb, though his role remains murky, obscured by conflicting accounts and deliberate obfuscation. Cobb was a landowner, one of the wealthier men in Gilmer County, with holdings in timber and a small mining operation. He was also, according to whispered tradition, the local organizer of what polite society called civic leagues, but what functioned, in practice, as the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's presence in northern Georgia in 1912 was less organized than it would become during its 1920s resurgence, but it existed as a network of white men bound by oath to enforce racial hierarchy through intimidation and violence. They operated in the shadows, their identities nominally secret, though everyone in small communities knew exactly who wore the hoods. The connection between Thaddeus Cobb and Mary Ellis is documented in only one source, a deathbed confession given by Cobb's grandson, Robert Cobb, to a hospice nurse in 1994. The nurse, Sandra Kimball, recorded the conversation in her personal journal, never intending it to become part of the historical record. It was only discovered after her death in 2008, when her daughter found the journals and, recognizing their potential significance, donated them to the Gilmer County Historical Society. According to Robert Cobb's confession, as recorded by Kimball, "My grandfather never spoke of it directly, but in his last years, when the morphine loosened his tongue, he would cry out in his sleep, always the same words. The girl knew, the girl saw. When I asked what he meant, he would turn his face away and say, 'There are things that must stay buried, boy, things that burn if you bring them to light.' And then he would weep, which I had never seen him do in all my life." What did Mary Ellis know? What did she see? To answer that question, we must understand what happened in the summer and fall of 1912, a period marked by rising racial tension, economic hardship, and a series of events that set the stage for catastrophe. In July 1912, a white farmer named Ezra Sutton was found dead in his barn, killed by a single gunshot to the chest. The death was ruled a hunting accident. Sutton had been known to drink heavily and handle firearms carelessly. But rumors circulated that Sutton had been involved in a dispute with several black timber workers over wages, and that his death was not accidental but retribution. Whether these rumors had any basis in fact is impossible to determine. What matters is that they were believed, and belief shapes action. A week after Sutton's death, a black man named Isaiah Hooks was dragged from his home by a group of masked men and beaten severely. He survived, but with injuries that left him unable to work. No arrests were made. The sheriff, when pressed, said there was insufficient evidence to identify the perpetrators. This pattern, accusation, violence, official indifference, accelerated through August and September. 2 more black men were beaten. A family's cabin was burned. A church service was disrupted by men firing shots into the air. The black community responded with silence and strategic invisibility, keeping their heads down, avoiding white spaces, and forcing strict curfews on their children. Survival required becoming unseen. But Mary Ellis did not become unseen. On September 15, 1912, during the Sunday service at Old Mercy Baptist Church, a service attended by both white and black congregants in their designated separate sections, Mary Ellis stood up in the middle of Reverend Whitmore's sermon and spoke. What she said depends on who tells the story. According to one account, preserved in the oral tradition of the black community, she said, "There is blood on this church, blood in the soil beneath the floorboards. The dead cry out, and you do not hear them. But God hears, and God will demand an accounting." According to another version, she said, "I have seen what you did in the darkness, and the darkness will consume you unless you confess and repent." A third version, recorded by a white witness decades later, claimed she simply said, "You think you are hidden, but I see you." What is consistent across all accounts is that Mary Ellis spoke with absolute authority, her voice carrying through the church with a clarity that silenced even Reverend Whitmore, and that she looked directly at specific individuals as she spoke, including, multiple sources agree, Thaddeus Cobb. The service ended in chaos. Mary was grabbed by her mother and rushed from the church. Reverend Whitmore attempted to restore order, assuring the congregation that the child is troubled, suffering from nervous affliction, and will be attended to. But the damage was done. Mary Ellis had named the unnameable. She had seen what was meant to stay unseen. What happened next unfolded over the course of 3 weeks, and the exact sequence of events remains contested. What we know for certain: On September 20, 5 days after Mary's outburst, her father, Samuel Ellis, was fired from his position at the timber mill. No reason was given, but the timing was clear. On September 28th, the Ellis family's cabin was visited by men who delivered a message: leave Gilmer County by the end of the week or face consequences. On October 3, Mary Ellis went missing from school. She was last seen walking home around midday. And on October 7th, Old Mercy Baptist Church burned to the ground. The fire began at approximately 2 a.m., according to witnesses who saw the glow from their homes and rushed to help. By the time they arrived, the wooden structure was fully engulfed, the flames visible for miles. Reverend Whitmore, who lived adjacent to the church, emerged from his home in a state of shock. He kept repeating, according to multiple witnesses, "She's inside. God help us. She's inside." The fire burned too hot, too fast for anyone to attempt rescue. By dawn, nothing remained but smoking timber and the stone foundation. In the days that followed, several details emerged that did not align with a simple accidental fire. First, the blaze had started simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the building, consistent with deliberate arson rather than a single point of ignition. Second, the church doors, both front and back, were found to have been nailed shut from the outside. Third, in the ash and debris, searchers found no human remains. No bones, no teeth, nothing to suggest a body had burned in the fire. And fourth, Mary Ellis was never seen again. The official conclusion, recorded by the county sheriff: fire of unknown origin. No evidence of foul play. The Ellis girl is presumed to have run away. No further investigation warranted. But the Black community knew differently. They knew that Mary had been taken. They knew she had been placed in the church. They knew the church had been set ablaze. And they knew, though they could not speak it openly, who was responsible. The Ellis family fled Gilmer County within a week of the fire. They resettled in Birmingham, Alabama, where Samuel found work in a steel mill. The family never spoke publicly about Mary's disappearance. Rebecca Ellis died in 1920, at the age of 42, of what death records list as heart failure. Those who knew her said she died of grief. Thomas Ellis, Mary's younger brother, became a minister. In a sermon delivered in 1958, preserved on audio recording, he spoke obliquely about his sister. Some lights burn so bright they become dangerous to those who prefer darkness. And when such lights are extinguished by men, God Himself takes note. The debt is not forgotten. It is merely deferred. Ruth Ellis, the youngest sibling, lived until 1989. In her final year, she gave a single interview to a local historian, during which she said, "They killed my sister. They burned her alive. And then they pretended it never happened. But Mary knew what they did before they did it." She told us that last week. She said, "They're going to try to make me silent, but I won't be silent. I'll speak louder in death than I ever did in life." And I believe she has. For decades, that was where the story rested, in oral tradition, in whispered warnings, in the selective amnesia of official history. Then, in 1987, the shoe was found. The discovery behind the false wall in the church basement reopened questions that had been buried for 3/4 of a century. But it also raised new ones, because the physical evidence did not match any of the prevailing narratives. If Mary Ellis died in the fire that destroyed Old Mercy Baptist Church in 1912, why were her remains found in the basement of a building constructed on the same site in 1915? The answer requires understanding what happened after the original church burned. In 1913, the congregation of Old Mercy Baptist, both white and black members, raised funds to rebuild. The new structure was larger, made of brick rather than wood, and included a full basement for Sunday school and community meetings. Construction was overseen by a local builder named Marcus Henley. His grandson, David Henley, provided crucial testimony in 1998 during a documentary project on Appalachian architecture. "My grandfather kept a journal," David explained, noting details of every building he constructed. In the entry for Old Mercy Baptist, dated March 1915, there's a strange passage. He wrote, "The Reverend insisted on a sealed chamber in the east corner of the basement, said it was for storage of church records, but there was no door, no access. We built it entirely enclosed, brick on all sides. When I questioned the logic, he said some things need to be kept but not retrieved. I was paid double my usual rate to ask no more questions." The sealed chamber, then, was constructed deliberately, and it was constructed at Reverend Whitmore's specific instruction. This discovery shifts the entire framework of the investigation. If Whitmore ordered the creation of a hidden chamber, and if Mary Ellis's remains, or at least evidence of her remains, were found within it, then Whitmore's role becomes far more complicated than that of a passive witness to tragedy. Did he know Mary Ellis' body was there? Did he place it there himself? Or was he complicit in a cover-up orchestrated by others? The photograph found with the shoe provides additional clues. Forensic analysis conducted in 1988 confirmed that the photograph dated to approximately 1910 to 1912, consistent with the timeline. But the photograph itself is unusual. It shows Mary Ellis standing in front of Old Mercy Baptist Church, the original wooden structure, identifiable by details in the background. She is alone in the frame, centered, staring directly at the camera. The image quality is remarkably sharp for the period, suggesting it was taken by someone with professional skill. But the most unsettling detail is this. Mary is wearing the white dress referenced in numerous oral accounts, the dress she was wearing on the day she disappeared. This suggests the photograph was taken either on the day of her disappearance or shortly before. And it raises the question, who took this photograph and why? The handwriting on the back, "May God forgive what we have done," was subjected to graphological analysis. The conclusion, though not definitive, suggested the writing belonged to a man, educated, right-handed, writing under emotional duress. The script shows evidence of tremor, possibly from age or fear. Reverend Josiah Whitmore was right-handed, educated, and would have been 63 years old in 1912. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. It suggests that Whitmore, whether as perpetrator or witness, was present when Mary Ellis died, that he kept a photograph and a shoe as evidence or memorial, that he ordered the construction of a sealed chamber to contain them, and that he carried the weight of this secret until his death in 1929. But evidence of Whitmore's involvement does not answer the central question: what happened to Mary Ellis on October 7, 1912? Here, we must turn to the testimony gathered over decades, testimony that forms a pattern, though never a complete picture. In 1952, a man named Elijah Washington, who had been a teenager in Elijah's black community in 1912, was interviewed by his grandson as part of a family history project. The recording was transcribed and eventually found its way to the archives of the Auburn Avenue Research Library in Atlanta. Washington's account: Mary Ellis was taken on the night of October 6th, not October 7 like the records say. She was grabbed from her family's cabin by men wearing hoods. They took her to the church, the old church, and they locked her in the basement. They planned to leave her there overnight to frighten her, to break her spirit, to teach her to stay silent. But something went wrong. Maybe she screamed too loud. Maybe someone worried she'd be heard. Or maybe, and this is what I believe, they'd always planned to kill her, and the rest was just pretense. Either way, the fire was set before dawn. And Mary Ellis died in that basement, breathing smoke and flames, calling out names that no one wanted heard. This account aligns with physical evidence: the church doors nailed shut, the multiple points of ignition, the absence of remains in the main structure. If Mary died in the basement, which was partially below ground and constructed of stone foundation, her body would have been shielded from the most intense heat. She would have died of smoke inhalation or burns, but her remains would not have been fully consumed. Later, when the new church was built on the same site, those remains would have been discovered during excavation. And at that point, a decision would have been made: reveal the murder and face the consequences, or bury the evidence permanently. Whitmore chose burial, but he could not quite bring himself to destroy the evidence entirely. Hence the photograph, the shoe, the sealed chamber. A hidden confession, a prayer for forgiveness encoded in brick and ash. This interpretation is supported by changes in Whitmore's behavior after 1912. According to church records and correspondence, he became increasingly withdrawn, his sermons taking on themes of guilt, judgment, and the impossibility of escape from divine justice. He suffered from insomnia and what contemporaries described as melancholic fits. In a letter to his sister, dated 1920, "I am haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. There are actions one cannot undo, sins for which there is no adequate repentance. I have tried to atone through service, through prayer, through the building of this new church as a monument to what was lost. But I fear it is not enough. I fear it will never be enough." Whitmore died in 1929 of a stroke. His funeral was well attended, his life celebrated as one of service and moral leadership. The secret in the basement remained sealed. But secrets do not stay buried forever, particularly in communities where oral tradition preserves what written records erase. The Appalachian region has a complex relationship with its history of racial violence. Unlike the Deep South, where lynchings were often public spectacles, documented and even photographed, violence in the mountains tended to be covert, disappearances rather than hangings, arson rather than public burnings. This made such violence easier to deny, easier to forget, easier to smooth over with silence. But silence is not the same as forgetting. The Black communities of Appalachia maintained their own histories passed down through generations in stories told after church, in songs coded with hidden meanings, in warnings given to children. Mary Ellis became part of this counter-history. She was the girl who saw too much, who spoke too loud, who refused to be invisible. And she paid the price that such refusal demanded in 1912 Georgia. But she also became something more, a symbol of resistance, a reminder that silence can be survival, but also complicity, and that some truths are worth dying to speak. In the years following the 1987 discovery, efforts were made to investigate further. The GBI's initial decision to close the case without prosecution, understandable given that everyone directly involved was long dead, did not satisfy those who saw the need for historical reckoning. Dr. Ellen Hartwell, the historian who discovered Whitmore's letter about Mary, spent 15 years researching the case. Her 2018 book, The Girl in the Basement: Race, Violence, and Memory in Appalachian Georgia, represents the most comprehensive examination of the evidence. Hartwell's conclusion: Mary Ellis was murdered on October 7, 1912, by a group of white men who viewed her intelligence and spiritual gifts as a threat to the racial order. Reverend Josiah Whitmore was, at minimum, a passive accomplice who failed to prevent the murder and subsequently orchestrated a cover-up. At maximum, he was an active participant. The sealed chamber in the church basement was both tomb and confession, a way of containing the physical evidence while preserving it as testimony. Whether this was done out of guilt, fear, or some combination is impossible to determine with certainty. But Hartwell also argues that Mary Ellis's story cannot be reduced to victimhood alone. Mary chose to speak, Hartwell writes. She knew the danger. Everyone around her knew the danger, and yet she stood up in that church and named what she had seen. That act of courage, even as it led to her death, disrupted the narrative of white supremacy that required black silence. She refused the role assigned to her, and in doing so, she claimed a form of power that outlasted her killers. This interpretation finds support in the oral tradition of Mary's descendants and the broader black community of northern Georgia. In their telling, Mary Ellis did not simply die. She sacrificed herself deliberately, understanding that her death would serve as testimony. She was a prophet, says Dr. Marcus Ellis, a great-nephew of Mary who researched his family history and located distant relatives in Birmingham. In the biblical sense, someone who speaks God's truth regardless of consequence. And like most prophets, she was killed for it. But also like most prophets, her death amplified her message rather than silencing it. This theological interpretation, Mary as prophet and martyr, has become increasingly prominent in recent years, particularly within black churches in Georgia. In 2012, on the centennial of her death, a memorial service was held at the site of Old Mercy Baptist Church, which had been converted to a community center in 1985 and then demolished in 1987. More than 300 people attended. The Reverend Jamila Washington, who delivered the eulogy, said, "Mary Ellis was 12 years old. 12! A child who should have been playing, learning, growing into the woman she was meant to become. Instead, she was murdered for the crime of seeing clearly and speaking truth. We cannot bring her back. We cannot undo what was done. But we can refuse to let her death be meaningless. We can speak her name. We can tell her story. We can continue the work of truth-telling that cost her everything." Following the service, a permanent memorial was erected, a simple stone marker with Mary's name, dates, and the words, "She spoke, we remember." The memorial has become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by those interested in civil rights history, by descendants of LJ's black community, and by people who have heard Mary's story and feel compelled to pay respects. But the site is also known for something else, something that falls outside the boundaries of conventional history and into the realm of folklore and the unexplained. Multiple visitors have reported experiencing what they describe as a presence at the memorial. Not frightening, they insist, but sorrowful. A sense of being watched by someone who wants to be acknowledged. Sarah Chen, a graduate student who visited the site in 2015, recorded her experience. "I went to take photographs for my thesis on civil rights memorials. It was mid-afternoon, bright sun, nobody else around. As I stood there reading the inscription, I felt this overwhelming sadness wash over me. Not my sadness, I felt fine before, but this was external, arriving from outside. And I know how this sounds, I heard a child's voice, very faint, saying, 'Tell them I wasn't afraid.' I looked around, thinking maybe there was a kid playing nearby, but there was no one. Just me and this stone and the wind in the trees." Chen is not alone. The Gilmer County Historical Society has collected more than 40 similar accounts over the past decade, enough to establish a pattern, though not enough to draw conclusions. Dr. Hartwell, the historian, is skeptical but open-minded. "Do I believe Mary Ellis' ghost haunts the memorial? No, I don't think that's a useful framework. But do I believe that places can hold memory, that trauma can imprint itself on a location in ways we don't fully understand? Yes. And do I believe that people visiting the memorial with genuine openness and respect may experience something, whether it's a psychological response to the weight of history or something more liminal? Yes to that as well." The question of whether Mary Ellis's consciousness or presence persists in any form is ultimately unanswerable through historical methodology. But the question itself reveals something important: the way her story continues to resonate, to disturb, to demand attention more than a century after her death. There is a hunger for justice that transcends the possibility of legal redress. When all the perpetrators are dead, when all the witnesses are gone, when the institutional systems that enabled the violence have been reformed or replaced, the hunger remains, not for revenge, but for acknowledgement, for the speaking of names, for the insistence that these lives mattered, that these deaths were not acceptable, that the silence was complicity. Mary Ellis' story serves that hunger, and in doing so, it serves a purpose her killers never intended. One of the most striking aspects of the Mary Ellis case is what it reveals about the mechanisms of historical erasure. Official records from 1912 are sparse. The Gilmer County Sheriff's report on the church fire consists of 3 sentences. No photographs exist of the crime scene. No autopsy was performed, or if it was, the records have vanished. No suspects were ever named. No investigation, in any meaningful sense, occurred. This is not unusual. Throughout the Jim Crow era, violence against Black Americans was routinely underdocumented, underinvestigated, and unpunished. The criminal justice system, far from being a neutral arbiter, was an active participant in maintaining racial hierarchy. But the Mary Ellis case demonstrates something beyond simple neglect. It shows active suppression. The sealed chamber was not an accident. Someone, likely Whitmore, possibly others, made a conscious decision to hide the evidence in a way that would prevent its discovery, while preserving it for what? Posterity? Divine judgment? A future reckoning? The psychological complexity of this act is worth considering. To seal evidence of a crime in the foundation of a church is to make the church itself complicit. It transforms the sacred space into a tomb, the house of God into a house of secrets. This suggests a mind torn between the desire for concealment and the need for confession. Religious scholars who have examined the case note parallels to medieval practices of walling up relics or criminals, a form of punishment and preservation that removes the body from sight while ensuring it remains present, contained within the structure itself. In medieval Europe, explains Dr. Patrician Como, a professor of religious history at Emory University, immurement, the practice of sealing someone alive or dead within walls, was associated with both punishment and sanctity. Saints might be entombed within church walls as a form of perpetual prayer. Criminals might be similarly entombed as eternal judgment. Whitmore, consciously or not, was drawing on this tradition. Mary Ellis' remains became part of the church's foundation, literally and symbolically. This interpretation casts the sealed chamber as an attempt at containment, not just of physical evidence, but of spiritual threat. If Whitmore and others believed Mary possessed the sight, that she could perceive hidden sins and speak prophetic truth, then perhaps they feared her power would persist beyond death. The chamber, in this view, was not merely a hiding place, but a prison, designed to bind her even in death. Whether such fears have any basis beyond superstition is, of course, another matter. But the fact that the fears existed, that they shaped behavior, makes them historically significant, regardless of their objective validity. And there is the curious matter of what happened to those involved in Mary's death. Tracking the fates of individuals in early 20th century Appalachia is difficult, but some patterns emerge from census records, death certificates, and newspaper archives. Thaddeus Cobb, the landowner suspected of organizing the violence, died in 1923 at the age of 59. The cause of death listed on his certificate is consumption, but a notation in his physician's file, discovered during a 2010 archive digitization project, indicates Cobb suffered from what the doctor called nervous collapse and persistent nightmares in his final 2 years. Reverend Josiah Whitmore, as mentioned, died in 1929. His final years were marked by increasing isolation and reports of erratic behavior. Marcus Henley, the builder who constructed the sealed chamber, lived to 1945. His grandson David reported that Henley would never set foot in Old Mercy Baptist Church after 1915, even though he'd built it himself. When asked why, he'd just shake his head and say, "Some buildings carry darkness, and I want no part of it." Of the other suspected participants, the men believed to have actually carried out the abduction and arson, records are even more fragmentary. But a review of Gilmer County death records from 1912 to 1925 shows an unusual pattern. Of the 15 white men aged 20 to 40 in 1912 who were known associates of Thaddeus Cobb, 9 died before the age of 50. The causes vary: accidents, illness, one suicide, but the statistical anomaly is notable. Is this evidence of divine retribution, as some oral traditions claim, or simply the harsh realities of early 20th century rural life, where violence, poverty, and poor health care led to early death for many? The answer likely depends on one's worldview, but the pattern has become part of Mary Ellis' legend. The belief that those who killed her were themselves marked for death, that justice came slowly but inevitably. This belief in cosmic justice is common in oral traditions dealing with unpunished crimes. When earthly justice fails, communities create narratives of supernatural justice, not because they necessarily believe in literal divine intervention, but because such narratives serve a psychological and moral function. They affirm that wrongdoing has consequences, that victims are not forgotten, that the universe operates according to moral laws even when human society does not. Mary Ellis' story has become such a narrative, and like all effective narratives, it has evolved over time, accumulating new layers of meaning with each retelling. In recent years, the Mary Ellis case has attracted attention from multiple quarters: historians, civil rights researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and paranormal investigators. Each group approaches the story from different angles, seeking different truths. For historians, Mary Ellis represents a case study in racial violence, historical erasure, and the recovery of suppressed narratives. Her story is one of thousands from the Jim Crow era, each unique, each tragic, each deserving of attention. For civil rights researchers, she exemplifies the price paid by those who challenged the racial order. Her act of speaking truth in that church service can be seen as an early form of civil rights activism, a refusal of the silence that segregation demanded. For true crime enthusiasts, the case offers mystery and intrigue: the sealed chamber, the cryptic photograph, the web of complicity and cover-up. And for paranormal investigators, Mary Ellis represents an unsettled spirit, a consciousness that cannot rest while her death remains unavenged or unacknowledged. In 2016, a paranormal investigation team visited the site of Old Mercy Baptist Church, now an empty lot, and conducted what they called an EVP session, an attempt to capture electronic voice phenomena, which some believe are the voices of spirits. The team, led by Marcus Brewer, spent 3 nights at the site using various audio and video recording equipment. Their findings, published on their website and later featured in a documentary, included what they claimed were voice recordings saying, "Remember me," and "Tell them." Skeptics, including Dr. Hartwell, were quick to point out the unreliability of EVP evidence, the power of suggestion, and the likelihood of audio artifacts being misinterpreted as speech. "If you go to a site expecting to hear a ghost," Hartwell noted, "you will find a way to hear what you expect. The human brain is extraordinary at pattern recognition, sometimes to the point of creating patterns where none exist." Yet Brewer and his team insist the recordings are genuine, and they point to one particularly unsettling piece of video footage: thermal imaging that appears to show a small heat signature moving across the lot, approximately the size and height of a 12-year-old child. "We weren't looking for Mary Ellis specifically," Brewer explained. "We were just investigating reports of unusual activity. But when we reviewed the footage and saw that signature moving in a pattern that matched how a child would walk, not random, not drifting, but purposeful, it was hard to explain it as equipment malfunction or environmental factors." Whether the footage shows a genuine anomaly or a technical glitch remains debated. What's indisputable is the power Mary's story continues to exert. Its ability to draw people in, to make them want to believe that something of her persists, that death was not the final word. This desire for persistence, for continuation beyond death, is deeply human. And in Mary's case, it's intertwined with the desire for justice. If she can somehow still be present, still be speaking, then perhaps the wrong done to her can still be addressed. But there is danger in this desire as well. The temptation to turn Mary Ellis into a symbol, a ghost, a martyr, a legend, can obscure the harder work of reckoning with the historical realities that killed her. Mary Ellis was a real child. She had a real family. She lived in specific conditions of racial violence and oppression. She died a real death, painful and terrifying. The fire that killed her was set by real men, for real reasons rooted in white supremacy and the determination to maintain power through terror. These facts matter. They cannot be spiritualized away or reduced to ghost stories, no matter how compelling those stories might be. Dr. Hartwell makes this point forcefully in her book. Mary Ellis deserves to be remembered as she was, a brilliant, brave child who was murdered. She deserves a full reckoning with the forces that killed her. She deserves her story told with honesty and rigor. What she does not deserve is to be reduced to a ghost story that titillates without challenging, that entertains without demanding change. This tension between memory as honoring and memory as exploitation runs through all work on historical trauma. How do we remember the dead in ways that serve their dignity rather than our own needs for meaning or excitement? The answer, perhaps, lies in multiplicity. Mary Ellis can be both historical subject and symbolic figure, both individual and representative, both ghost story and civil rights narrative. These approaches are not mutually exclusive. They are different ways of honoring different aspects of a complex truth. In 2020, a coalition of activists, historians, and descendants of Elijah's Black community launched the Mary Ellis Truth and Reconciliation Project. The goal, to create a comprehensive record of racial violence in Gilmer County from 1865 to 1965, with Mary's case as the centerpiece. The project has collected over 200 oral histories, digitized thousands of documents, and identified at least 37 other cases of Black individuals who died under suspicious circumstances during this period, deaths that were never properly investigated. Mary Ellis was not alone, says Project Director Keisha Tatum. She was one of many. But her story survived because of the shoe, the photograph, the sealed chamber. Most victims of racial violence in this era have no memorial, no marker, no public record. They're just gone. Our goal is to recover as many names as we can, to tell as many stories as we can, to make visible what was deliberately hidden. The project's work has been challenging, not least because it requires confronting truths that many would prefer to leave buried. Some descendants of white families implicated in the violence have been defensive or hostile. Others have been supportive, acknowledging their ancestors' actions and expressing commitment to reconciliation. One particularly moving testimony came from a woman named Margaret Whitmore, great-granddaughter of Reverend Josiah Whitmore. In a public statement read at the 2021 Memorial for Mary Ellis, Margaret said, "I cannot undo what my great-grandfather did or failed to do. I cannot erase the pain his actions or inactions caused. But I can acknowledge it. I can say clearly what happened to Mary Ellis was murder. Those who perpetrated it, those who enabled it, and those who covered it up, including Josiah Whitmore, bear responsibility. I stand with those seeking truth and justice, even when that truth implicates my own family. This kind of acknowledgement, painful as it is, represents a crucial step toward genuine reconciliation. It models the willingness to confront difficult history rather than defending or minimizing it. But reconciliation requires more than acknowledgement. It requires material change. Changes in power structures, resource distribution, educational curricula, and public memory. To that end, the Mary Ellis Project has successfully lobbied for several initiatives. First, the inclusion of Mary's story in Georgia state history standards, ensuring that students learn about racial violence in Appalachia, not just the Deep South. Second, the establishment of a scholarship fund in Mary's name, supporting Black students from Gilmer County pursuing higher education. Third, the designation of the site of Old Mercy Baptist Church as a historical landmark, with interpretive signage explaining its history. And fourth, a commitment from Gilmer County officials to conduct a formal review of all unsolved deaths of Black individuals from the Jim Crow era, with the goal of issuing official acknowledgments and apologies where evidence of racial violence exists. These are small steps, but they matter. They represent the transformation of historical trauma into contemporary action, the conversion of grief into change. They also represent Mary Ellis's continuing agency. More than a century after her death, she is still speaking, still demanding accountability, still insisting on truth. Not through literal haunting, but through the ways her story mobilizes people toward justice. This is the power of historical memory when handled with care. Not to wallow in past pain, but to use that pain as fuel for present transformation. This is the power of historical memory when handled with care. Not to wallow in past pain, but to use that pain as fuel for present transformation. As the investigation into Mary Ellis's death continues, because in a real sense it will never be fully complete, certain questions remain unanswerable. We will never know exactly what she saw or knew that made her dangerous enough to kill. The specific identities of all involved will never be confirmed beyond doubt. The precise details of her final hours will never be recovered. But perhaps these gaps in knowledge are themselves significant. They remind us that history is always partial, always incomplete, always subject to revision. They humble us, preventing the false certainty that closes off further inquiry. And they leave space for Mary Ellis herself, not as historical object fully known and cataloged, but as subject who retains mystery, complexity, and dignity. In the end, what we can say with certainty is this: Mary Ellis existed. She was born in 1900 in Gilmer County, Georgia. She was Black, gifted with intelligence and spiritual perception, and brave enough to speak truth to power. She was murdered in October 1912, at the age of 12, by white men who feared what she represented. Her death was covered up by individuals who prioritized racial order over justice. Her body was sealed in a hidden chamber, where it remained for 75 years. And when it was finally discovered, her story began the slow work of returning to light. She was a child who should have lived, who should have grown into the woman she was meant to become, who should have had the chance to use her gifts in a world that recognized rather than feared them. She did not get that chance, and that is the tragedy at the heart of this story. Not supernatural, not mysterious in any mystical sense, but tragically, brutally human. The crime against Mary Ellis was not unique. It was part of a systematic campaign of terror designed to enforce white supremacy through violence. Thousands of Black Americans were killed during the Jim Crow era, lynched, burned, drowned, disappeared. Most of their names are lost, most of their stories untold. Mary's name survived, and through her name we remember all the others whose names did not. This is the weight her story carries, This is why it matters to continue investigating, continue remembering, continue speaking her name. Not because there is some supernatural mystery to solve, but because there is a moral debt to pay. A debt of acknowledgement, of honoring, of ensuring that the deaths of children like Mary Ellis are never again acceptable, never again overlooked, never again sealed behind walls of silence. In the Appalachian Mountains of northern Georgia, where the land holds memory in its bones, Mary Ellis is not forgotten. She is spoken of in churches and classrooms, in history books and memorial services. She is present not as ghost, but as reminder, a 12-year-old prophet who saw what others refused to see and spoke what others refused to hear. And in that speaking, she gave us all a template for courage. The willingness to name injustice even at the cost of safety, the refusal to be silent in the face of evil, the understanding that some truths are worth dying for because without them we are all diminished. More than a century has passed since Mary Ellis stood up in Old Mercy Baptist Church and spoke her truth. But the act reverberates still, echoing through time, challenging each new generation to answer the question: when confronted with injustice, will you speak or will you be silent? Mary Ellis answered that question with her life. And her answer, defiant, courageous, costly, remains a challenge and inspiration. In the place where she died, where her remains were hidden for 3/4 of a century, a stone now stands bearing her name. Visitors come, some seeking history, some seeking the supernatural, some simply to pay respects. And if they stand there long enough, in the quiet beneath the Appalachian sky, they might feel something. Not a ghost, perhaps, but the weight of history, the presence of unfinished business, the call to continue the work that Mary Ellis began, the work of speaking truth, the work of demanding justice, the work of refusing to let the dead be forgotten or the living be silent. This is Mary Ellis's legacy. This is the secret that Appalachian history tried to bury but could not destroy. She was here. She mattered, she spoke, and we remember.